I would assume that when most people think of the Japanese adventure genre, the series that first comes to mind is Ace Attorney. The franchise has a strong fan following around the world, and helped introduce many people to the ADV genre. However, despite the franchise getting its start on the Game Boy Advance in Japan, there are surprisingly few ADVs of note on the Nintendo handheld. There would eventually be a flood of adventure games on the Nintendo DS, but outside of a few ports, the occasional licensed game, and the obligatory installment in the Jinguji Saburo series, it was pretty slim pickings for ADVs on the Game Boy Advance outside of Ace Attorney. But there were a few exceptions, such as a little-known adventure title created by a tiny developer that still garners some quiet praise from a niche audience. A game called 01, an obscure ADV that was marketed by its publisher as the largest adventure game on the GBA, and was apparently so nice, they made it twice. Zero One is an SF adventure released for the Game Boy Advance in 2003 that stars a young junior high student named Nagoma Jokoji. Nagoma lives in the future year of 2004, along with Ritsuko, his older sister, and their father, Nobuhiko. While Nagoma is a seemingly average kid, his family is full of world-renowned scientists. Ritsuko is currently studying artificial intelligence, where she has even created her own AI, while his father is a robotics expert that specializes in cybernetics. However, Nagoma's father has recently gone missing, and the game begins with his home suddenly being attacked by a terrorist group known as Rude, who are searching for Nobuhiko so they can use his scientific knowledge for their own evil ends. The story takes off from there, as Nagoma and his sister attempt to escape from the agents of Rude, while getting help from the police and a mysterious superhero who keeps coming to their rescue. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. 01 is a kitchen sink style of storytelling where the creators clearly included anything and everything they thought was cool. Not only does 01 contain cyborgs and terrorist groups, but eventually psychics, UFOs, and even an interdimensional being known as Gamer also enters the mix. The story goes places, and the game's publisher, Fuuki, advertised this as a selling point. Sci-fi, action, mystery, psychological horror, parody, romance. 01 is a game that starts with a simple missing persons case and ends with an epic story about the mystery behind the birth of mankind. While the story seems unpredictable, 01's gameplay is what you would expect from an average ADV. Outside of a few segments where Nagoma can be controlled directly, the game plays a lot like a novel game, where the player simply reads text while making choices. During moments of high action, choices are timed, forcing the player to make quick decisions. And there are also several mini-games that appear during specific scenes. These require the player to do things like drop an object at just the right time to hit an enemy on the head, or run away from danger by mashing the A and B buttons. Little micro-games that inject a bit of action into the game. Structurally, 01 is similar to a long-running TV show, where the narrative is split up into episodes, which are further divided into 3 story arcs, with episodes 1 through 4 being the Android arc, 5 through 8 being the Psychic arc, and the last 2 episodes covering the story's climax. As one would expect, the player's choices can affect how the story in these arcs progress, and Nagoma can even grow closer to one of the game's heroines, who each have their own endings. In fact, Fuuki liked to boast about the large number of endings featured in 01, stating that it contained over 100. But in reality, many of these choices basically just lead to game overs, rather than fully developed endings, where something bad happens to Nagoma if the player makes the wrong decisions. After these bad endings, the game will offer a hint on what the player can do to avoid their fate, similar to titles like 428 Shibuya Scramble. Overall, while its systems were straightforward, 01 was really shooting for the fences at the time of its release, featuring a lot of content for a game developed by a fairly small studio on a handheld like the GBA. As mentioned previously, Zero One was created by a company called Fuuki, with the title only being their second game released for the GBA. Fuuki's main business was actually operating arcades and amusement centers in the Kansai region of Japan, with their website suggesting that they also exported arcade hardware to other countries. During the 1990s, Fuuki began publishing games made by other Asian arcade developers, and even began making a few original titles themselves, including some puzzle games and a fighting game franchise called Azura Blade. In the early aughts, the developer also began branching out to handheld development, with Yokkaido being their debut title for the Game Boy Advance in 2002, an RPG that involved capturing yokai and having them fight against each other in puzzle-based battles. While Yokkaido had adventure-style story segments, Zero One was a very different kind of game compared to all of Fuuki's previous titles. However, this release feels a bit less random, knowing that Zero One's scenario writer was a man named Ikuya Ochi. Ochi had previously worked at a developer named Metro Corporation, a work-for-hire studio that has helped a number of publishers create games over the years. At Metro, Ochi planned and wrote a Saturn adventure game in 1998 based on the Kindaichi case files. This Kindaichi game has attracted a bit of a cult following over the years, due to the title subverting the usual detective mystery setup by having the player control the murderer instead of the franchise's protagonist, where the goal is to create the perfect crime and avoid getting caught by Kindaichi. Sometime after this game's release, Ikuya Ochi left Metro and joined Fuuki, where he was mainly involved in the company's GBA titles. Knowing this, Zero One's creation makes a lot more sense, since the title bears a lot of similarities to Ochi's Kindaichi game in terms of presentation and design. Regardless, Ochi and the team at Fuuki clearly wanted another crack at polishing their work, because despite however Zero One sold, the very next year, Fuuki actually released a remake of the title called Zero One SP. Along with the first game's story content, Zero One's narrative was rearranged and expanded, even including an additional story arc and new characters. The game's structure was also drastically changed. Instead of just progressing through the story linearly, episode by episode, the player now enters the different story arcs based on the decisions they make at the beginning of the game, which can fundamentally change what happens in the story thereafter. Additionally, the original Zero One featured fairly simple artwork that didn't really stick out much. Perhaps in an effort to rectify this, Fuuki hired manga artist Takehiko Ito to redo the designs for the game's entire cast. Throughout the 90s, Ito was famous in Japan for creating manga like Hayotaike Reunite, and for working on shows like NG Night Ramune and 40, while in the West, he is most well known as the creator of Outlaw Star, penning the original manga the classic anime was based on. Ito's designs were certainly more eye-catching, with Zero One SP being semi-famous for its fan service, which was rare on a kid-friendly platform like the Game Boy Advance. In fact, all of Fuuki's titles on the GBA, including the original Zero One, had a level of sensuality and even violence that was unlike most titles on the handheld. But this eye-catching artwork, unusual content, and ambitious scale helped Zero One SP attract a small audience. While the original game did garner some fans, its reception was tepid at best, with some critics reviewing the game rather poorly. However, Zero One SP was seen as an improvement in almost every way, leading to the game making a much bigger impression on the niche adventure fandom in Japan, with people being a lot more positive on the game at the time of its release. Fuuki themselves even linked to a few fan pages on the game's official website, which were full of fan art, guides, and people expressing their love for the game. Years later, some fans have even commented that Zero One SP was the game that introduced them to the novel game genre, and maybe even made them fans of sci-fi stories in general. even though I can't read the story myself, I can understand how a game like this could garner that kind of sentiment. Playing through either version of Zero One, you really get the sense that the development team put a lot of love into making the game. Just the fact that they remade Zero One a year later shows their dedication to creating something memorable. Even on their old website, there are a bunch of small details that make it clear that the developers were really invested in Zero One. There was a page where Nagoma and his sister spoke in character about Zero One and why it was so cool. The company hosted character popularity polls, talked about their upcoming radio ad, and even had their own message board where fans could discuss Zero One. Clearly a lot of effort went into making this game. In fact, Zero One SP almost feels like a doujin title created by a group of GBA fans long after the platform was dead. It has that kind of energy to it. However, Zero One OG and SP received very limited print runs in the GBA, and were clearly not big moneymakers, with Fuuki's staff even saying as much on the game's BBS forum. After SP's release in 2004, Fuuki almost stopped making video games altogether, and instead refocused on developing video slot machines, with the only exceptions being two very obscure arcade puzzle games released sometime around 2009. Today, Fuuki seems to have disappeared, and is most likely no longer active, with the company's website still being online, but containing a bunch of broken links, making Zero One SP, in many ways, the company's last hurrah in terms of game development. So that's Zero One, an ADV clearly made by a tiny passionate team that has garnered a similarly tiny fan base over the years. While I can't personally judge the game's quality since I don't know Japanese, it appears to be a cool little title, and is an example of the type of niche adventure game we almost never see localized for the West, officially or otherwise. It's a title that only had an impact on a very small audience, and has since been lost in the shadows casted by larger figures in the genre. But I hope to keep exploring these shadows in the hopes of finding other interesting Japanese adventure games to bring into the light. Until next time.